This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Hello, I'm Leese, and welcome to the latest episode of Think Like a Vegan, a companion podcast to our book, also entitled Think Like a Vegan. Because we have viewed other animals through the myopic lens of our self-importance, we have misperceived who and what they are. Because we have repeated our ignorance one to the other, we have mistaken it for knowledge. Tom Regan, the American animal ethicist and philosopher, wrote that. And my guest today, Tim Reysoo, follows Regan's words to their logical conclusion by developing the concept of human privilege, and then extending the notion of social privilege to make sense of the enormous power differential between humans and animals in society. Tim writes, similar to how white privilege and male privilege expose the unfair and exploitative relations that result from oppressive systems such as racism and sexism, human privilege can expose the mechanisms that ensure successful reproduction of animal oppression. Getting a clear picture of how species privilege operates can help make us more privilege literate with regard to our unexamined privilege we enjoy by virtue of belonging to the socially constructed human group. I'm thrilled to welcome to the podcast Tim Reysoo. Tim and I met last year at the Himalayan Vegan Festival, and we shared the stage for a couple of talks. It was evident from those talks we were comrades in philosophical outlook and activism. I then learned about the topic of his Master Thesis, and I knew I had to get him to talk to us. Tim's thesis develops the concept and social category of, quote, species privilege and human innocence. Welcome, Tim.
It's great to see you again as well and to be here. I'm honored.
Tim studied philosophy and international development studies at the University of Amsterdam. He conducted his graduate fieldwork in Ghana on the role of social movements in leaving fossil fuels underground. He takes a strong abolitionist approach when it comes to animal rights, arguing animal welfare improvements only lead astray from the goal of animal liberation. Tim also has extensive experience running animal rights campaigns, doing vegan street outreach, promoting plant-based policies to the government, and holding public lectures on the issue of animal oppression. Tim sent me the introductory chapter to his thesis, and it's brilliant. Seriously, I get to read so much good stuff doing this podcast. It's an excellent bonus. And this passage reflected an experience many of us have had, and which I believe crystallizes what human privilege looks like. I want to read it to you before we hear directly from Tim. He writes, when educating people about the contours of a vegan world in which non-human animals will no longer serve as human property, the first comment one can expect is that the person is worried about the perpetrators and says, but what's going to happen to all the farmers, butchers, etc.? This reply proves the obvious point that one's human privilege naturally leads to identification with human farmers exploiting non-human animals instead of identifying with the victims of this violent ideology and economic system of exploitation. With that, Tim, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk with you about privileges. In particular about a new concept that I developed, species privilege. But before we delve into that, I think it's good to get clear what do we mean when we talk of privilege. So a privilege is something we have nothing, we didn't work. It's not because of our effort. It's just something we have in virtue of our group membership. So obviously, male privilege comes to mind, class privilege, white privilege, and privileges are key in ensuring successful reproductions of systems of oppression, basically. So in order for racism to be reproduced efficiently, there needs to be something as white privilege. For a patriarchy to be reproduced efficiently, there needs to be the associated privilege of male privilege. And a privilege is designed in a way that whenever the privilege is brought up, the people that enjoy the privilege, they feel threatened and they react defensively. So in a situation where there's men and the male privilege is being raised by, let's say, a feminist, the men will all start to react very defensively and saying, no, we just work hard. It's due to our own effort. So it really makes it invisible, basically, the hierarchical structure. And as we know, any system of oppression, in order to function and to get reproduced, these unjust exploitative relations need to remain invisible, right? I mean, this is, I guess, quite obvious, because why would rational people, stimulate and support systems of oppression all the time? This wouldn't make sense. So again, this is something we all know, cognitive dissonance. It's a very important psychological mechanism in all these systems of oppression, because, well-minded people, good-hearted people tend to support horrific systems of abuse all the time without them knowing that they're doing it. And that is why privilege is, it's not the privilege is actually not something that belongs to the people, but that hijacks their authentic self, I would say. Now, and these privileges, they really block. You have these privileges, but you're not aware of them. So, for example, me as a man, a lot of the time, people ask me if a certain neighborhood is safe, and then I tend to say, yeah, that neighborhood is safe. And of course, this is from my perspective. I'm 6'3". I'm a man. I did martial arts. So probably if there are vagabonds on the street, they won't see me as a target. And it's a very different perception than when you are, let's say, a young, a small lady walking there, who would, they would see that as a target a lot more than they would do with me. And that's something for me, I can't even start to imagine being in that sense. I wouldn't know that, I can learn from female friends that, wait a second, Tim, you're 6'3", you've done martial arts, so you have a whole different, you have a big male privilege right there that just blocks your view. And so privileges are important to address, because only when we become aware of our privileges can we help to offset our privileges. Now, I was actually doing a masterclass on humanities and decolonial studies, and we were looking at the work of Gloria Wekker, who wrote this work called White Innocence and the Paradoxes of 400 Years of Colonialism. And Wekker, in her work, she looks at white privilege, in particular in the Dutch situation, and then she comes up with this term white innocence. So it's not any kind of benevolent innocence. It's actually a very disingenuous, a kind of false innocence. And while I was reading the text of Wekker, it made a lot of sense to me, because I know how Dutch like to, that the self-understanding of the Dutch is that we are anything but racist. But yeah, obviously we have this stupid Zwarte Piet tradition, blackface tradition, which is there's no way around saying that is not racist. That is just a very toxic form of a racist tradition. And also of course, the Dutch was a colonial empire, so some of that racism must have been reproduced. It's still here. So reading on Wekker and how she develops white privilege and then white innocence, and how the Dutch have a totally distorted self-understanding as being free of racism and having nothing to do, that they have kind of like cleansed themselves from those 400 years of colonialism. And also how she draws on the cultural archive to actually, research all kinds of sources and traditions on their racist and colonial content. I was thinking, but wait a second, there is a similar thing that works structurally quite similar, and that's not on behalf of your racial group status. That's not because of your gender. That's not because of your class. That's actually on basis of your species membership status. And so then I all of a sudden thought that, hey, species privilege, why nobody ever talked about this before? Because the fact that we are a human being gives us so much privileges that we just take for granted. The fact that you cannot be butchered, the fact that you cannot have medicines tested on you, the fact that you cannot be separated from your family. And I can go on for a couple of hours probably. So all these privileges we have in virtue of belonging to the legally constructed human group. And then the cognitive dissonance of what Wecker terms white innocence, I also saw very interesting parallels with the fact that you are human and when your species privilege is brought up. Because most of the time, if you do bring up the species privilege, whether it's in animal consumption, whether it's in animal entertainment, you get the same kind of reaction that you saw in the case of male privilege and white privilege. So it's outright denial, it's ridiculization, and it's even this inversion, right? So a lot of the times now the patriarchy is starting to crumble, and a lot of men say like, yeah, it's we are oppressed now as men. It's totally ridiculous. There's not a country where female salaries are higher than those of men, but still this is the perception of men because of their male privilege. And the privilege, once it starts to be challenged, the immediate reaction of that privilege is to hold on, because the privilege is like a virus. It needs a host. And the same when I went to South Africa, all the Afrikaners and all the white folks I spoke in South Africa, even though they were living in big houses and they had big swimming pools, and most of the black population are living off $1 a day, even scrambling for wood to get through the cold night. And then I would sit in a restaurant, and those white Afrikaners, they would tell me, yeah, now it's us being discriminated, and it's 180 degrees reversal. We are being oppressed, which is, it's just crazy. But that was their perception. And then even in the case of animal abuse, for example, when you go to a zoo and you raise the fact that, these zoos are, terrible institutions of animal abuse, people will say, you are crazy. They're being better cared for than I am. I wish I had the life of an animal in a zoo. I wish I didn't need to work and somebody would just provide food for me. So you see the same kind of ridiculous inversions. And that's then why I think species privilege comes with this notion of human innocence. So it's this very disingenuous form of innocence. And it's actually also being displayed in Wecker, in her work, by herself. So in the outset in her work, she says we have to be intersectional. Now, for everybody listening to the podcast, so intersectionality basically means that you cannot really understand one type of oppression without looking to the other systems of oppression, because they co-evolved and they are entangled all the way down. So Wecker, she looks at white privilege, how it then intersects with systems of classism, with systems of homophobia, and she kind of like draws a map and a typology of how this all works together. But then she just is completely oblivious to the fact that, wait a second, animals also fit into this whole colonial tradition, not only materially, but also symbolically. So I think it's in the first or second chapter, she describes how she arrives in Amsterdam, and where her and her family were having a nice day at the zoo. She actually puts a picture there where her and her siblings are sitting on a donkey. And I was just reading this and I was like, how obvious is this human innocence here? And this is not just Wecker. This goes for, academics across the spectrum. It's such a large blind spot of even critically minded people that study oppression, that study the history of slavery, that they just tend to be completely unaware of the privilege they have in virtue of their human group status. Because the zoo was not only a terrible institution for animal exploitation. Before, zoos also exhibited human populations. So zoos were really this, this exemplary institute of the colonial empire. So zoos were showcasing animals from faraway places, humans from faraway places, plants, and it was really showcasing, like, look, this is what we have conquered. This is what what's belonged to us now. And just discussing the zoo as some kind of an innocent institution is just it's also, from a scholarly perspective, you're just missing this intersection that the construction also of blackness and of animalness, you can't really get a good understanding of racial discrimination without looking at the place of the animal in ideology. And that's, again, something I think is also worth mentioning, because for any kind of human destruction to succeed, you have to dehumanize your opponent. And this is happening nowadays still. The feminist, my mom, she's a hardcore feminist. She was really disappointed yesterday. She read in a newspaper that now it was about time that when men harass women, we should call them out what they are, namely pigs. And my mom was like, okay, but now we're just exchanging one system of oppression for another. This is, why? Why do we now need to? Because this, again, means that we view non-human animals as, as worthy of being mistreated. Because if we wouldn't think mistreating non-human animals, then referring to being treated as an animal would not have that moral implication. For me, then it becomes very interesting how these systems of oppression, classism, sexism, speciesism relate to each other, how they reinforce each other, how they are entangled in history with one another. And you actually, when you look at the cultural archive, it becomes very strange that certain social classes are then associated with a very specific type of animal abuse. Think of how rich people consume caviar, or how rich people wear fur, and this is, again, here we see the intersection with classicism and speciesism, but it's along all these different power differentials. Yeah, so most of the time, a certain ethnic group will be associated with a certain type of animal exploitation, and then when you go across the world, and you look at all the human traditions, from Muslim cultures to Hindu cultures to basically everywhere, there are these traditions that always revolve around a certain type of animal exploitation. So again, you can really look at our cultural archive and see, like, okay, how does a certain type of animal exploitation intersects with a certain type of social esteem
We'll stop here for a short musical break and return with more from Tim Reysoo on human privilege. This is 505 Suji by Matthew Gerstenberger. We're back for the second part of Tim Reysoo talk on human privilege.
So having discussed Wecker's example of the zoo, she then also talks about how the Dutch sense of self is a particular distortion because it just denies our complicity in colonial systems of exploitation. And then I thought, but wait a second, actually our human understanding, our human sense of self at large, in fact, is a paradox. Because if you look at what we're doing, we are enslaving, murdering, torturing countless of other beings. We are an absolute catastrophe for life on the planet. Yet, nobody thinks of themselves as an animal abuser. In fact, most people will identify as animal lovers. Most, average people that consume animal products will view themselves as animal lovers. And they don't have the self-understanding, they don't understand themselves as being horrific animal abusers or being complicit in horrific forms of animal abuse. And I think that the Dutch sense of self, in particular, when it comes to animal abuse, again, is a very striking form of human innocence, because the Dutch situation is outrageous. We are the most intensive country in the world when it comes to factory farming. So there's no other country in the world where there's more animals per capita, so per head of the population being exploited, and per land area. But not only that, the Dutch industry, whether it's mega trawlers, sailing in the Chinese seas, whether you go to poultry slaughter factories in Myanmar, most of the time there is, of course, a trace back to the West, and in particular to the Dutch. So we are very proud. Our animal industries are ranked number one. Most of the times, actually, these animal captains of industry, they go there with the government. They have this big fancy commission, and they help to develop the poultry sector in a developing country. And another form of human innocence is then that the Dutch like to think that we have the highest welfare standards. And again, this couldn't be further removed from reality. So most of the methods that we use for executing animals are not done in the interest of the animals. It's just done because it's more effective and you can kill and process more animals at the same time. So there's a big sense of being somehow benevolent, but actually being the complete opposite. And that is why I think that the concept of human innocence is so powerful. And it actually, the past week, we had the elections. Now, the elections were, I'm still in shock. I can't quite comprehend what happened, because it's never happened in Dutch history before. So the Dutch, we have the highest amount of animals anywhere else in the world in terms of density. And this causes major environmental catastrophe to the point that our nitrogen levels are so incredibly high that Brussels said, look, we have been warning you for decades. Right now, you're not going to have any more permits because the nitrogen budget is completely filled up. So what happened? You can't build anything anymore in the Netherlands. We went from 130 kilometer per hour to 100 in all the highways. So it's a big, situation, big emergency. So the government said, all right, you know what? We're going to reduce the livestock staple with 50%. Now, of course, the animal farmers, and not just the animal farmers, also all the other industries, especially those other industries that are on top of them, the food import companies, the slaughterhouses, the whole conglomerate. So they organized a big campaign and actually started their own party called BBB. It's something like the Farmers' Republic, loosely translated, and they won. It's incredible. They won with their whole propaganda. And when you look even in their propaganda videos, they say The Hague, which is the government, where the government is seated, they say The Hague, the government, they want to kill half of our cows. And, I'm looking at that and like, okay, but what are you going to do with them? So there's this human innocence takes on very, very interesting shapes and forms, because obviously these animal farmers, that's how they view it, They view it as somehow the government is harming their animals. So for me, the human innocence was displayed massively in these past elections. Same with the general public. They have absolutely no idea what goes on in these farms. And it's so interesting that even when these populist parties go to these animal farmers to romanticize this image of the farmer, they never go into where the animals are kept. So they show the apple trees and they show the family life and that's it. So there's for me, it's just so obvious that that people buy for this. But then I do think there's a reason they support this type of ignorance, because it's not in their interest, right? How many white people will actually look in actively why they have all this wealth, why they have all these benefits? Because if you do recognize that your privileged group status is unjust, is unearned, then you are obliged to do something with that. And for most people, this is an uncomfortable realization. It's uncomfortness, which they tend to avoid. So I do see that the general public is complicit, and they need to remain complicit as long as they're not willing to reflect on their species privilege. Because if they would reflect on their species privilege, then obviously they would have to radically alter their behavior. Even though for me it doesn't feel that radical, obviously. But again, that is the perception that they have. Maybe last two things that I want to mention that I look at in my thesis. So there is this distorted concern that Wecker describes as well. So at one point, Wecker describes how she's in an audience and she's talking about a slave girl that was raped by the slave ship's captain, and then a white male from the audience interrupts her and asks, "But what happened to the captain?" And she uses this example as sort of a showcasing of misplaced concern. And where is this misplaced concern stemming from? Namely, that for the white male captain, it's just easier. He naturally identifies more with the white captain than with the oppressed slave women. And I think that what about the captain, we can actually replace that with what about the farmer? Because most of the times when I'm doing vegan street outreach and I'm explaining to people how a vegan world would look like, the immediate concern and question that I get from my audience is, okay, but what's going to happen to the farmer? What's going to happen to all the butchers? And I think this is, again, this is similar structurally similar psychological explanation, namely that for humans, they just naturally identify more with the human oppressors than with the non-human animal victims. So I think there's a lot more. I mean, I've just started with this whole endeavor. I think there's a lot more interesting parallels that we can learn from, and that we can then help to offset our species privilege. And I do want to end on a hopeful note, because of course you might think like, oh my God, all these oppressions, and they all reinforce one another and they're all entangled. How are we ever gonna, do something about it? I actually believe that our species privilege is the privilege we can most easily offset. So, of course, if you choose to stop wearing animals, stop consuming animals, stop going to animal shows, you're basically, your taxpayers' money probably will be used to a certain extent to subsidize animal farming. So you're still not completely out of it. To offset our human species privilege is by far the most easiest one of our privileges that we can use for something good and to help emancipate non-human animals.
Thank you, Tim. I love that. I think naming the thing, naming the problem, naming the issue is so critical, because it then allows you to realize what's happening, allows you to make a decision, allows you to evaluate what you're doing and what's happening around you. So I think it's really critical. And you said a couple of things that I really like, a couple of words. You used the word complicity and hijacking the authentic self. I think those are really interesting things, because one, you have to realize that we are complicit, and you have to deal with that. Whether you say, well, I don't care, and then you just go on being whatever you want. Or you have to say, as you said, especially ending on the hopeful note, is, okay, well, then I need to do something about it. And obviously being vegan is the easiest thing that we can do to do something about it, or at least to start doing something about it. And then the hijack the authentic self, and how, you kind of put it together with the privilege taking over as a virus in some sense, although it's something that we perpetuate ourselves, how it doesn't want to give up. And giving up, you're giving something up about yourself, but you're also giving something up about yourself by not realizing that, because you could be someone else. Like it's always, and I don't know what you think about this. I want to hear what you think, but a lot of times when you talk with people, they have a sort of an idea of who they are morally, and they say, "Well, I'm a good person," and they believe, like, "Well, I'm a good person. I eat animals. I'm not vegan, and all these different things, but I'm still a good person." And it's like, yes, but forget about that. That's not the thing. I mean, yes, you're a good person, because we only see animals when we want to, and it doesn't, we don't think about it when we don't have to. But it's that facing your authentic self, and that facing your idea of yourself that's extremely uncomfortable for people. And you mentioned that in your discussion as well. And do you find that that's the most difficult part when you're talking with people, when you're doing the street outreach and so forth, that it's the most difficult part to get over?
Yeah, definitely. I guess, again, discussing it in a different context, when the whole Black Pete discussion started in the Netherlands, a lot of white people were actually like, "But I'm not a racist, I'm not a racist. I'm not a racist because you don't hate Black people, maybe, but you have been participated in a tradition that mocks Black people." So what you now have to do with this uncomfortable realization is that, you have to admit that you participated in a racist system, and that went against your authentic self because you're not a racist. So now all you have to do is just stop celebrating this tradition or taking the racist elements out of it. Now, that is why I think I'm so hopeful, because it's not that we have to teach people new values. People already have the vegan values. So the only thing what we have to do is that, look, you have been acting against your core values. I'm not saying you're a speciesist. You're not, because you say you're against animal abuse. You don't want to witness animal abuse. You don't want to kill animals yourself. But you have been participating in that. So you've actually acted against the authentic self. And now, with this new information, you actually have the choice, the option to, put your values in line with your actions, and it's uncomfortable maybe that you have participated in, you have acted against your core self for all these years and without knowing it. And that is uncomfortable. But the good thing is that now you can, step out of that and actually reclaim that authentic self. And most people see veganism as a sacrifice. Now, from my own experience and from people that are outreaches in the street that I still am in contact with, it actually feels like a liberation. It doesn't feel like a sacrifice at all, because you're actually liberated from a horrific system of abuse.
Completely agree. Exactly. It's not at all a sacrifice. I love that. Thank you so much, Tim. This has been brilliant. Again, it's fantastic to see you again, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Before we go, where can people follow your work, whether online or elsewhere? And do you have any projects that you'd like to promote?
Oh, well, the website is still in the making, but if you search my name, Tim Reysoo, you'll probably, if you put it in Google, you'll find some of the papers that I've written for newspapers. Probably you also find my academia page, where I tend to upload work in progress. And otherwise, the LinkedIn, you can connect me with me there. Current projects that I'm working on. I'm hope to do a PhD, start my PhD, and working on developing a theory of multi-species oppression and privilege. But in the meantime, I'm also working with some animal rights organizations, in particularly the SAFE movement, and we hope to start developing the Activist Academy, so we can really help vegans get active and help them, give them the emotional tools and just some self-care stuff as well, because it is a hard path. Not replacing the animal products, but just knowing what's happening to animals. And other than that, I'm also very active in politics, which probably has a long way to go, because the current elections were a sign that we have to work harder as a movement, especially on the political front. So for all the vegan activists listening, not only join Labour, join the Tories, and try to advocate to those in power.
Well, thank you again, Tim. I really appreciate you coming on today.
Yes, thank you. I'm very grateful.
I know I'm a bit of a nerd, but I am very excited about Tim's work. Like the term speciesism, naming human privilege and human innocence allows us to crystallize something we might even have intuitively felt, and that helps us to effect real change. I know I intuitively understood human privilege. It was that realization that led me to become vegan in the first place. I write about that in Think Like a Vegan when I talk about why I went vegan in my 40s. It was when I was sitting in a doctor's office with other people waiting for IVF treatment. And I say, there we all were in all our human privilege of making reproductive choices while we were taking babies away from other females with impunity. And that was it for me. I still rue the fact it took me over 40 years to realize that. My hope is with work like Tim's and others we've heard from on this podcast, we have the words and knowledge to all learn much sooner, and sooner abandon being non-vegan. Next time, Dr. Josh Milburn returns, and his colleague, Dr. Sarah Van Hoosen, joins us to discuss animals in war.
We tear things up when we go round. We burn things up when we go round. We speed things up when we go round.
That's it from me, Leese. Thank you for listening. I'll post a transcript in due course on our website, thinklikeavegan.com. Remember, you can get in touch by email at thinklikeaveganbook@gmail.com or find Think Like a Vegan on social media. You can find me, more of my work and my upcoming events at emmysgoodeating.com and on social media. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and leave us a review. And you can buy Think Like a Vegan anywhere you buy books and audiobooks or request it from your local library. Production credit goes to Jim Moore of Bloody Vegans Productions. Theme music provided by Jenny Moore's Mystic Business from the eponymous album. The opening tune is Flashback, and we close with Tear Things Up. The interval music is by Matthew Gerstenberger, aka Seismicity, on SoundCloud.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.